started with a casserole dish. That's the part nobody believes when I tell them, but it's true. A blue Pyrex casserole dish my wife had owned since 1981, and the day I couldn't find it in my own kitchen was the day I knew something was wrong. I'd been looking for it for 20 minutes. I wanted to make the chicken and rice she used to make every Sunday, the one our grandkids called Grandma Rice, even though the rice was the most ordinary part of the dish. I couldn't find the casserole. I checked every cabinet twice. Then I sat down on the kitchen floor in my socks, and I cried for the first time in maybe 4 months. Not because of the dish, because Marlene wasn't there to tell me where she'd put it. She'd been gone since the previous January. Heart attack, the kind that doesn't give you any warning. She was loading the dishwasher, and then she was on the floor. I did CPR for 9 minutes until the paramedics came, and I knew before they got there. You know when you know. We'd been married 38 years. I was 66 the day she died, and I felt about 110 by sundown. I lived in Asheville, North Carolina, in a brick ranch house we'd bought in 1996 when my son was 14 and just starting to act like he hated me, which he later admitted was just being 14. The house had a screened porch that Marlene had painted seafoam green one summer when she got bored. There was a dogwood in the front yard she planted as a sapling. I'd been a project manager for a regional construction firm for 29 years before I retired in 2018. I had a good pension, Social Security, and we'd been savers our whole lives. The mortgage was paid off in 2014. We were comfortable. Not rich. Comfortable. That word matters later. My son lived in Charlotte, about 2 hours southeast. He worked in pharmaceutical sales, made good money, drove the kind of car you notice in a parking lot. He'd married his wife in 2011. I'll be honest about her up front. I never disliked her. I never warmed up to her either. She was the type who'd ask how you were doing and then check her phone before you finished answering. Marlene used to say she was high maintenance in a low maintenance package, which I never fully understood, but I trusted Marlene's read on people because Marlene was almost never wrong. They had 2 children, a boy who was 11 when his grandmother died, and a girl who was 8. Those kids were the reason I got out of bed some mornings in 2023, and I mean that literally. My son started calling more after the funeral. He'd been a good kid, and he'd grown into a man who was trying his best, even if his best was sometimes shaped by the woman he married more than by what he actually thought. The calls were short at first. Then they got longer. Then his wife started getting on the phone too, and that's when the suggestions started coming, not demands. I want to be clear. Nobody demanded anything in the beginning. It was always a suggestion, always wrapped in concern. Dad, that house is so big for one person. Have you thought about being closer to the kids? We have so much room here. The schools in our neighborhood are some of the best in the state. The kids would love having you around all the time. I'd say I appreciated it, and I wasn't ready to make any moves. I'd say Marlene's tomatoes were just coming in, and I wanted to see the season through. They'd say, of course, no rush. Then they'd call back the next week. My daughter-in-law sent me a brochure in October, an actual brochure, in the mail for a 55 and over community in Charlotte. I sat with it on the kitchen table for an hour because I didn't know what to feel. Was she trying to help? Was she trying to push me out before I even moved in? I called my sister-in-law, Marlene's younger sister, who lived in Tennessee and who had loved my wife the way only a baby sister can. She said, "Honey, that woman has been measuring your house for 2 years and you didn't see it." I told her she was being dramatic. She said, "We'll see." By December, I was struggling. I'm not too proud to say it. I was eating cereal for dinner 3 nights a week. I'd stopped going to the men's breakfast at church because every time someone asked how I was holding up, I'd lose it in front of the eggs. The house got quiet in a way I couldn't describe to anyone who hasn't lived through it. The clock above the mantel ticked louder than it ever had when she was alive. I find myself talking to the dogwood like it was her. When my son called on Christmas Eve and asked, if I'd consider coming to stay with him for a while, I said yes before I'd really thought it through. He sounded relieved. His wife got on the phone and said they had a guest suite over the garage, fully self-contained, that they'd been meaning to clear out for months and would have ready by the time I came. She said it like it was a gift she was giving me. I thanked her. I drove down on the 7th of January, 2 days after the 1-year anniversary of Marlene's death. I'd packed 2 suitcases and a box of photographs. I left almost everything else in the house, which I asked my neighbor to keep an eye on. I told myself it was temporary. I think I even believed it. The guest suite was nice. I'll give them that. Hardwood floors, a little kitchenette with a microwave and a mini fridge, a private entrance up a flight of outside stairs, a queen bed with too many decorative pillows that I put in the closet the first night, a bathroom with one of those rain shower heads that Marlene would have loved. I sat on the edge of the bed that first night, and I did not cry, which felt like progress. The first few months were the best months I'd had since she died. My grandson was deep into a phase where he wanted to learn how to fish, and I happened to know how to fish, and we spent every Saturday morning at a pond, about 15 minutes from the house. My granddaughter was the kind of kid who narrated her own life out loud, and she'd follow me around the yard while I helped my son with landscaping projects, telling me about her teacher and her friends, and the way her brother chewed too loud. I picked them up from school 3 days a week starting in March because my daughter-in-law had a promotion at her company and the new hours didn't work with the school schedule. I didn't mind. I liked it. I'd missed having a reason to be somewhere at 3 in the afternoon. In April, my son brought up the Asheville house. He did it carefully, the way you bring up something you've been thinking about for a long time. He said the housing market in western North Carolina had gone crazy and that holding on to the place while not living in it was costing me money in taxes and insurance and upkeep, and that the equity could be sitting in an investment account doing something useful instead of just being a building I wasn't using. He said I clearly wasn't going back and that maybe it was time to make it official. He wasn't wrong. I knew he wasn't wrong. I'd been avoiding the thought for months. I drove up by myself in May. I walked through every room. I sat on the screened porch for 2 hours. I pulled 3 tomatoes off the plants Marlene had started before she died, the ones my neighbor had been watering. I cried in the bedroom. I called a realtor the next morning. The house sold in 9 days, $4,000 over asking. After paying off some end-of-life expenses I'd been putting off, and the realtor's commission and a few small repairs, I cleared $278,000. I deposited it into the savings account Marlene and I had opened together in 1986. I transferred the account to my name only after she died, but I still thought of it as ours. That money represented 38 years of 2 people being careful. I want you to hold on to that because it matters. 2 weeks after the closing, my daughter-in-law brought up over dinner that they'd been looking at houses in a better school district. Her exact words, a better school district. She said the place they were currently in was fine, but the schools were underperforming compared to the neighborhood about 10 minutes north, where homes started at $700,000. She said they were close, but not quite there on the down payment. She said this very casually while passing the salad. My son didn't look at me. I went to bed, and I thought about it for 3 nights. I thought about what Marlene would say, and I knew exactly what she would say, which was nothing, because she'd want me to make my own decision. I thought about my grandkids and that better school district. I thought about the $278,000 sitting in an account, money I had no specific plan for, money that wasn't going to bring my wife back, no matter how long it sat there. I gave them $35,000. I called it a gift in writing because I'd been a project manager for 29 years, and I knew you put things in writing. I gave it on a Sunday afternoon in the kitchen, and my daughter-in-law cried, real tears as far as I could tell, and my son hugged me for the first time since the funeral, and I felt like I'd done a good thing. They closed on the new place in July. 5 bedrooms, 3.5 bathrooms, a backyard with a fire pit, a finished basement with a wet bar. The guest suite over the garage transferred just fine to the new house. The new one was bigger, actually. It had its own deck with a view of trees. I told myself I'd lucked into a kind of late-life adventure I hadn't asked for, but didn't deserve to complain about. Things were good for a while. I was useful. That's the word I'd use. I bought the groceries on Tuesdays and Fridays. I picked the kids up 3 days a week. I helped my son restain the deck in August. When my daughter-in-law's car needed a battery, I drove it to the shop and paid the $87 without saying anything because that's what family does, and I had the time and the money, and they just stretched themselves to buy a house. I wasn't keeping score. My pension and Social Security came to about $3,300 a month after Medicare. That was my money. I used it for my own things. I bought myself a new fishing rod in September. I took the grandkids out for ice cream every Friday after school. I paid for a hotel room when my sister-in-law came to visit for a long weekend in October because I didn't want her staying in my converted garage situation. I lived modestly, but I lived. In November, my daughter-in-law mentioned the utility bills. The new house was twice the size of the old one, she said, and the heating costs were not what they'd budgeted for. She mentioned this at breakfast, looking at her phone. I told her I'd be happy to throw in $300 a month toward utilities. She said I didn't have to. I said I wanted to. She said, "Well, if you insist." I noticed she didn't say no. By February, the $300 had become $400 because they'd added a streaming bundle and I'd been watching the basketball games on it anyway. I had watched maybe 2 games. By March, my daughter-in-law had a system where she ordered groceries through an app, and I'd transfer her $500 every month for my share. I never saw an itemized list. The groceries that arrived included things I would never buy. Brand name protein powders, a specific kind of imported sparkling water, 3 different kinds of cheese, none of them cheddar, which is the only kind I actually eat. I was contributing close to $1,000 a month by the spring, on top of which I was still buying my own incidentals, paying for the kids' ice cream, covering the occasional repair. I was also providing about 12 hours a week of childcare, which I knew, because I'd looked it up one night, would have cost them somewhere between $16 and $20 an hour at any after-school program in the area. I didn't bring it up. I didn't want to bring it up. I wasn't keeping score, even though apparently I was, because I knew the numbers. My son called me one afternoon in late April. He was upstairs in the main house. I was in the garage suite. He called me on the phone instead of walking out. I noticed. He asked if I had time to sit down and talk through some things that evening, and I said yes, and I spent the rest of the day with a feeling in my chest I hadn't had in a long time. The kind of feeling you get when you already know what's coming, but you're hoping you're wrong. We sat in the dining room. My daughter-in-law had made coffee. The kids were at a friend's house. She did most of the talking, the way she always did. She started by saying how grateful they were to have me there, how much the kids loved having me close, how I'd been an absolute rock since I moved in. Then she shifted into the part she'd been rehearsing. She said the household budget had gotten tight. She said the new mortgage was higher than they'd originally planned for, and the kids' activities had ramped up, and they were having to think creatively about resources. She said she'd been doing some research, and that the garage suite, if rented to a tenant on the open market, would conservatively bring in around $1,800 a month, possibly $2,000. She said she wasn't suggesting they wanted a tenant. She said she was just being transparent about the numbers. She said it would feel more equitable if I could contribute $1,200 a month toward the value of the space, in addition to the utilities and groceries I was already covering. Thou of the coffee. I didn't drink it. I asked my son what he thought. He looked at his wife, then at me, and he said, "Dad, I think she's making fair points. I want to tell you I exploded. I want to tell you I delivered a 5-minute speech that ended with everyone weeping and apologizing. What I actually said was, 'Let me think about it.' Then I went out to the garage and up the stairs to my suite, and I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. I don't know if I'd describe what I felt as anger. I think it was closer to clarity, the kind of clarity that comes after you finally stop pretending. I thought about Marlene. I thought about the fact that she'd known, on some level, that this woman was not going to be on my team if it ever came down to it, and that my son, who was a good man, would be too tired or too tangled up to push back. I thought about the casserole dish I never did find. I thought about my dogwood tree, which had probably been ripped out by now, or maybe was thriving for somebody else. I called my sister-in-law in Tennessee. I told her everything. She didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then she said, "Honey, what would Marlene tell you?" I said I knew what Marlene would tell me. She said, "Then I don't think you need me on the phone." I waited a week. In that week, my daughter-in-law was friendlier than she'd been in months. She made me a breakfast sandwich one morning. She mentioned that she'd seen a nice senior community not too far away, just in case I was interested. My son brought me a coffee in the garage one afternoon and asked if I was doing okay. I said I was thinking. He looked relieved, which told me everything I needed to know about what he was hoping I was thinking. On a Tuesday, I told my son I wanted to go to lunch with him. Just us. We went to a sandwich place 10 minutes from the house. We sat in a booth. I started by telling him I loved him because I did, and because I wanted him to remember that part later. Then I laid it out. I told him I'd given him $35,000. I told him I'd put more than $22,000 into his household over the previous 14 months in cash. I told him I'd provided childcare worth $10,000 at market rate. I told him I'd repaired and maintained things in his home without asking for a dime. And I told him that being asked, on top of all of that, to pay rent on a converted garage where I'd been told I was wanted as family was not something I was going to do. He didn't argue. That was the thing that hit me the hardest. He didn't try to defend it. He looked down at the sandwich he hadn't touched and he said, "I know, Dad. I asked him why he'd let it happen. He said his wife handled the money. I said I knew that, but it wasn't an answer. He said he'd been telling himself it would work itself out. I said it was working itself out, just not the way he'd hoped." I told him I was leaving. Not Charlotte, but the house. I'd been talking to a realtor for 2 weeks already. I'd looked at 3 condos in a complex about 12 minutes from where they lived, all of which I could buy outright with what was left in my account after the gift and the contributions and a year and a half of household life. I told him I'd already picked one. 2 bedrooms, a small balcony, ground floor, because I wasn't getting any younger. I told him the kids could come over whenever they wanted and that I'd keep picking them up from school if it helped, because it had nothing to do with them. He cried in the booth, right there, a 40-something-year-old man crying into a club sandwich. I didn't reach across the table because I knew if I did, he'd never forgive himself for it. I let him have his moment. When we got home, I told my daughter-in-law together with him in the kitchen. I told her I'd be moving out by the end of June. She did a thing with her face, not quite a smile. The kind of expression you make when you've been preparing for bad news, and instead you got the news you were actually hoping for. She said she was so sorry to hear it, and that they hoped this wasn't because of any miscommunication. I said it wasn't a miscommunication. I said it had been communicated very clearly, which is how I knew what to do. She didn't say anything to that. The next 6 weeks were polite. That's the only word for them. My son was quieter than usual. My daughter-in-law made small talk about the weather. The kids didn't know anything was happening. I told my grandson on a Saturday after fishing that I was getting my own place nearby, and he asked if there was a pool, and I said no, but there was a pond at the park near the new place where we could fish whenever I picked him up. He was satisfied with that. I closed on the condo on the 18th of June. I paid for it in full, $212,000, which left a healthy cushion in my savings. I moved in on a Wednesday. I bought a new mattress and a new couch and a recliner. I kept a few framed photos and the box of photographs I'd brought from Asheville. I bought myself a coffee maker that ground the beans fresh. The first morning, I made my coffee. I sat on my balcony in a folding chair I'd had since college. I drank it slowly, and I watched the sun come up over the parking lot, and I thought, well, here I am. I'd like to tell you my daughter-in-law called and apologized. She didn't. She probably never will. I'd like to tell you my son became a different man overnight. He didn't either, though he's better than he was. He calls me twice a week now. We've had conversations we never had when I was living under his roof, the kind of conversations you can only have when nobody's calculating what you're worth to them. He's admitted he should have stopped it sooner. I've told him I forgive him, because I do. He's my son. That's not a small thing. I see the grandkids 3 times a week now. More than I did when I was living over the garage, which is the part that still surprises me. My grandson is 12 now and learning to tie his own flies. My granddaughter started taking piano lessons and plays me a new song every time she visits, even when she hasn't quite finished learning it. They love coming to the condo because I let them eat ice cream out of the carton with spoons, which I don't think is allowed at home. My daughter-in-law and I are civil. We say hello when I pick up the kids. We don't pretend to be close. I don't need her to apologize, and she doesn't need to. We both know what happened. There's a kind of peace in not lying about it. I'm 68 now. I have a condo with my name on the deed. I have an account with a balance that belongs to me. I have a routine. I have a Tuesday morning men's breakfast at a diner that I drive to in the same Camry I've had for 9 years. I have a dogwood I planted in a pot on my balcony, which is the smallest dogwood you've ever seen, but it's mine. What I'd tell anyone going through something like this, anyone who's reading this and recognizing pieces of their own life in it, is something I learned the hard way. Generosity is one of the best things a person can offer, but generosity is a gift, not a debt. The minute someone starts calculating how much more they can extract from your generosity, they've stopped seeing it as a gift, and you have to stop offering it that way too. That's not bitterness, that's not revenge, that's just understanding the shape of the thing you're in. I gave from love. That part was right. What I got wrong was thinking love meant erasing myself. Love doesn't ask you to disappear. It never did. The people who love you don't need you to vanish to prove it. Marlene knew that. She'd have known it the first time my daughter-in-law sent that brochure. She'd have known it the first time the words, "better school district" came up at the dinner table. She'd have figured out where I was headed long before I did. She used to say I was the smartest man she ever met about everything except people, and that I made up for it by being decent enough that people usually didn't take advantage. She was right about that too. Eventually they did, and eventually I figured it out. I'm not angry. I want to make sure I say that clearly. Anger is for surprises. By the time I left that garage suite, I wasn't surprised by anything. What I felt was something cleaner. The feeling of finally putting something heavy down, after carrying it longer than you should have. I drink my coffee on my own balcony now. I water my little dogwood. I pick up my grandkids on Wednesdays and Fridays. I miss my wife every day, and some days more than others, but I no longer feel like I'm betraying her by being okay. I think she'd be proud of me. I think she'd say, I took the long way around, but I got there. She always did say I'd figure it out eventually. She just didn't always have the patience to wait for me to catch up. I'm caught up now. Took me long enough. I've been sitting with all of this for a while now, and I think the part I want anyone listening to take with them is this. What happened to me didn't happen overnight. It happened the way most of these things happen, in inches. A brochure in the mail. A casual question at dinner. A transparent conversation about resources. Each step on its own seemed reasonable. It was only when I added them up on the back of a napkin one night in that garage suite that I saw the shape of what I'd walked into. And that's the lesson, I think. Bad situations rarely arrive as one big moment. They arrive as 100 small ones, each one easy to excuse, until you look up and you don't recognize your own life. I gave my son and his wife $35,000 because I love them and I had it to give. That part I would do again. What I wouldn't do again is mistake their gratitude for a contract. I assumed that giving generously meant I'd earned a permanent place at the table. What I learned is that some people see generosity as a starting bid. The minute I'd given the first gift, the second one was already being calculated. That wasn't because Marlene was an evil woman, and Lord knows my son isn't a bad man. It was because nobody had ever told them no, and I'd certainly never modeled it. I'd been so busy being decent that I'd forgotten decency without limits is just a slow form of disappearing. 3 things saved me. The first was honesty. The kind I had to do in a notebook by myself, adding up numbers I didn't want to add up. The second was the voice of someone who loved me, my sister-in-law Rosalind on the phone in Tennessee, asking me a question I already knew the answer to. The third was nerve. Plain nerve, the willingness to walk into a sandwich shop with my son and tell him the truth, even though it cost me the version of family life I'd been clinging to. None of those three things came from anywhere except inside me. Nobody else was going to do that work. If you're a parent, especially an older parent, especially a grieving one, hear me out. Loving your children doesn't mean letting them rewrite the terms of your life while you're not looking. The strongest thing you can do for the people you love is stay a whole person in front of them. Children, even grown ones, can sense when you've made yourself smaller to keep the peace. They lose respect for you, even when they're the ones who asked you to do it. Standing your ground isn't selfish. It's the only honest gift you have left to give them, because it shows them what self-respect actually looks like. I'm 68. I have my own front door. I have my own coffee. I have my own dogwood, even if it lives in a pot. I miss my wife every single day, but I know she'd recognize the man pouring that coffee on the balcony. That's the man she married. He just got a little lost for a while. He's back now.